Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we are stepping into a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most infamous kings. For centuries, Henry VIII has lived in our imagination as a grotesque caricature, the obese monarch with 6 wives, a turkey leg in one hand, and a glare that could send courtiers running. But what if I told you this image, the one painted in schoolbooks and popular culture, is only the surface, that behind the portraits, beneath the polished armour and gilded halls, lay a body rotting from the inside out and a mind unravelling, in ways so dark even his closest servants were afraid to speak aloud. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? Tonight we peel back the layers of that myth, because Henry was not merely a king of appetites. He was a man consumed by disease, paranoia and cruelty, and the very collapse of his body set in motion events that would reshape the world. His obsession with heirs, his humiliating failures in the bedroom, his terrifying punishments for wives and subjects alike, all of these were not just the eccentricities of a tyrant. They were symptoms of a deeper truth, a ruler whose flesh betrayed him and whose insecurity poisoned a kingdom. The official portraits, like Hans Holbein's famous canvas, show us a broad-shouldered monarch standing square legs apart, radiating strength. But look closely, those images were not honest likeness. They were propaganda. Holbein painted a fantasy, a performance of invincibility. Beneath the silks and ermine, Henry's legs were ulcerated and suppurating. Beneath the crown, his thoughts darkened with rage and paranoia. To stand before the king was to inhale the perfume meant to cover the stench of his wounds, and to wonder if the smile he offered today might become a death sentence tomorrow. And that perhaps is the hook that should unsettle us. Because Henry's story is not just about personal decay, it's about how one man's suffering unchecked by accountability could ripple out into the lives of millions. The Reformation in England, the destruction of monasteries, the execution of friends and queens, the tearing apart of families across the realm, all of it can be traced back to a king who could not accept weakness, who waged war against his own body and made the world pay the price. So as we begin this journey, don't think of Henry merely as a bloated monarch with 6 unfortunate wives. Think of him as a cautionary tale, a man whose carefully polished image concealed a nightmare of flesh and power, and whose desperation to hide his failures reshaped the course of history. And tonight we're going to uncover the secrets that history books softened, sanitized, or chose to forget. The secrets of a king whose body was a battlefield, whose bedchamber was a stage for cruelty, and whose soul was perhaps the most decayed relic of all. Before we descend into the darkness of Henry's final years, we need to remember who he once was, because the terror of his decline is only understood when contrasted with the brilliance of his youth. When Henry VIII first ascended the throne in 1509, he was not the swollen, ulcer-ridden tyrant we picture today. He was a dazzling figure. Tall for his age, broad-shouldered and radiating vitality, he was the Golden Prince of Europe. Ambassadors described him as the very embodiment of Renaissance ideals, athletic, learned, musical and charismatic. He hunted tirelessly, jousted with reckless courage, and composed poetry and song with the flair of a courtly knight. This Henry was adored. He was not merely a king, he was a spectacle of health and vigour in a time when the monarch's body was inseparable from the body of the realm. To see Henry ride into a tournament glittering in armour, lance steady in his grip, was to believe that England itself was strong, youthful, and destined for greatness. His court celebrated him as Apollo reborn, a godlike figure striding across Europe. But vigour is fragile, and the young king's appetite for glory, food and women would begin to erode that radiant image. By the mid-1530s the decline was undeniable. There were accidents, brutal jousting falls that left him with head injuries and shattered legs. Historians suspect one such fall in 1536 left him unconscious for hours, altering not only his body but his mind. There were feasts, mountains of roasted meats, sugary confections and endless goblets of ale and wine. And there was disease, likely diabetes, compounded by obesity, infections, and a body increasingly incapable of healing itself. By the time he reached his 40s, the athletic youth had been swallowed by a man nearly 3 times his early size. His face puffed with swelling, his belly strained against fabrics, and his once powerful legs now dragged behind him in agony. Servants whispered of the king's ulcers, of his groans echoing down palace corridors at night, of the ever-present stench that clung to his presence. And this mattered for more than vanity. In Tudor politics, a king's health was a mirror of divine favour. The monarch's body was not his alone. It was a symbol of the nation's strength, God's blessing upon the land. When Henry's body faltered when he could no longer ride at the head of his armies or charm ambassadors with athletic grace, the illusion of England's invincibility faltered too. His decline became a crisis not just of flesh but of state. That tension between the glowing promise of youth and the grotesque collapse of age is at the heart of Henry's story, because the man who once embodied Renaissance vitality became within a generation a ruler whose very presence inspired dread, and it is that transformation from golden prince to rotting tyrant that makes his tale so haunting. By the mid-1530s, the golden prince of Europe had become something far darker, a king whose very body seemed to betray him with every step. His most notorious affliction was not hidden massive leg ulcers that turned his body into a prison of agony. Imagine it, wounds so deep they oozed pus constantly soaking through bandages, staining his stockings and filling the air with the unmistakable odour of rot. Courtiers wrote of the smell that followed him everywhere as if death itself walked in his shadow. The stench was so overpowering that attendants burned incense and poured perfumes by the gallon, desperate to mask the reality that the king was decomposing while still alive. Servants tasked with changing his dressings would sometimes gag or vomit, unable to withstand the sight and smell. Yet none dared complain to show disgust before Henry was to risk your own life. The ulcers were more than a medical condition. They became part of the unspoken terror of serving him. What caused this horror? Historians and medical experts still debate. One theory points to osteomyelitis, a vicious bone infection that corrodes from within, leaving the victim in constant pain. Others suggest uncontrolled diabetes, worsened by his enormous weight and indulgent diet, slowed his body's abilities to heal. The jousting accidents of his youth had left his legs permanently damaged. One deep wound may have become infected, festering for decades in an age before antibiotics. Whatever the cause, the result was the same Henry VIII, once a paragon of vigour, now limped through his palaces with legs that were rotting beneath him, and Tudor medicine offered little comfort. Physicians of the era believed in balancing the humours: blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Treatments included cauterization with boiling oil, applying poultices of herbs and animal fat, or even lancing the ulcers to let the poison out. These efforts provided only temporary relief. In reality, they likely worsened the infection, deepening his pain and increasing the smell. Yet here lies the deeper cruelty. For Henry's wives, courtiers and servants, this wasn't just a private nightmare. They lived in a world where the king's flesh was sacred, where to acknowledge his decay was almost a form of treason. So they endured the queen forced to share a bed with the stench of rotting flesh, ambassadors forced to bow low in a haze of perfumed smoke, servants trembling as they tended wounds that would never close. Every step Henry took was agony. Every movement a reminder that his body was not just failing, it was betraying him. And the echoes of that betrayal would resound in his temper, his paranoia and his cruelty in ways the realm would not soon forget. If the ulcers were a public humiliation, the collapse of Henry's bones was a private torment that never left him. His body, once a weapon of war and pageantry, became instead a cage of agony. Reports circulated among servants that his joints cracked audibly when he moved. Courtiers whispered of nights in which the king's groans echoed down the corridors, sleepless hours filled with the grinding of bones and the laboured shifting of a man who could no longer find comfort in rest. Every attempt to rise from bed was a ritual of pain, each step accompanied by the splintering sound of a body betraying itself. One account, perhaps apocryphal but haunting, suggests Anne Boleyn herself once confided in a letter that she could hear Henry's bones crack and grind like branches in frost as he shifted beside her at night. Whether true or embroidered, later the image captures a terrible intimacy, a queen forced to lie next to a king whose body was literally breaking apart beneath his flesh. The insomnia this produced cannot be underestimated. Nights without rest breed not only exhaustion, but rage, and rage in Henry's case was deadly. His temper, once a flicker, became a furnace. Chronic pain alters the brain, fraying patience, amplifying paranoia, distorting judgment. Imagine a man who rules an empire yet cannot bend his knee without agony, who cannot walk without smelling the rot of his own body. Every ambassador, every courtier, every wife became a mirror, reflecting back to him the weakness he could not endure. It is easy to laugh at Henry's legendary tantrums, the thrown goblets, the shouted threats, the swift condemnations, but behind that fury was something more human and more terrifying pain. A pain that was constant gnawing inescapable, a pain that stripped away reason and left only the raw nerves of ego and fear. For Henry, every cracked bone was an insult, every night of broken sleep a reminder that he was no longer the golden prince of tournaments. His fury at others' wives who failed to give him sons, courtiers who failed to flatter him enough, subjects who dared to resist his will may have been in part displaced fury at his own betraying flesh. And here lies the paradox. The king who claimed divine authority, who imagined himself chosen by God to rule without question, found himself imprisoned in a body that made him feel cursed. The cracking of bones was not just a physical sound, it was the shattering of the illusion that he was invincible. And when a man who cannot admit weakness holds absolute power, the entire kingdom is forced to pay for his pain. If Henry's body was failing him in private, his response was to assert control in public, and nowhere is that more vividly displayed than in the fall of Anne Boleyn. Anne had once been his obsession. The woman for whom he defied Rome broke with the Pope and set an entire nation out on the road to religious revolution. Yet within just 3 years of their marriage, she became the victim of one of the most elaborately staged humiliations in Tudor history. The charges were grotesque fictions. Adultery, incest with her own brother, even conspiring to kill the king, all impossible yet presented as undeniable truth. Henry's agents carefully crafted the accusations, selecting supposed witnesses and extracting confessions through fear and manipulation. The outcome was decided long before Anne ever stood trial. But this was not merely about removing a wife, it was about annihilating her completely. Henry wanted to erase her honour, her memory, her dignity, to turn the woman once exalted as queen into a symbol of treachery and corruption. Her brother George Boleyn was dragged into the same nightmare. Imagine Anne forced to sit in the courtroom knowing she was doomed and hearing her own brother accused of unspeakable crimes against her. His conviction, like hers, was predetermined. He was executed brutally, his death a prelude to hers. The message was unmistakable. Henry was not just ending Anne's life, he was dismantling her entire family line. This trial was not about justice, it was theatre, carefully orchestrated spectacle meant to terrify. The Great Hall at Westminster was transformed into a stage. Nobles watched, the Queen condemned murmurs spread through the crowd, scribes recorded every accusation as though it were truth. The law was not blind here. It was an actor in the king's performance. And this is what makes Anne's fate so chilling. Her execution was not a private act of vengeance, but a public ritual. By parading her downfall through fabricated charges and the destruction of her kin, Henry turned the courtroom into a weapon. He used humiliation as policy, shame as a form of execution before the axe ever fell. History echoes with such spectacles. Centuries later in Stalin's Soviet Union show, trials would parade supposed traitors through the courts, their fates sealed before the judges spoke. In Mao's China, humiliation rituals in public squares stripped individuals of dignity before crushing their bodies. In each case, as in Henry's England, the purpose was not only to eliminate a rival, but to demonstrate the terrifying power of the state and of the man who stood above it. Anne Boleyn's downfall was thus more than a marital tragedy. It was the template of tyranny. Henry had discovered that fear could be magnified by ritual, that humiliation could extend death into eternity. And once a ruler learns to weaponize humiliation, no subject, no friend, no wife is safe. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. When Anne Boleyn was dragged through her trial and condemned to die, her daughter Elizabeth was only 2 years old, too young to be physically present in the courtroom, too innocent to grasp the storm that had gathered over her mother's head. And yet in a sense Elizabeth was always there, invoked by gossip, whispered about by courtiers, a silent figure whose very existence heightened the spectacle of Anne's disgrace. For what greater humiliation could Henry inflict than this, to not only destroy a queen, but to stain the future of her child? Anne's downfall was staged as more than treason against the crown. It was cast as a crime against the natural order, as if even her motherhood were poisoned. The court may not have placed Elizabeth on a bench to witness her mother's trial, but symbolically she was forced to sit through every accusation. Every word aimed at Anne struck Elizabeth, too shaping how the world would view her from the very beginning of her life. And here lies the tragedy that ripples forward in history. Elizabeth would grow to become one of the most formidable rulers England had ever seen. The Virgin Queen Gloriana, the monarch who presided over an age of exploration and cultural flourishing. But behind the steel and majesty of her reign lingered a shadow, the trauma of being the daughter of a condemned traitor. As a child, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate after Anne's execution. Overnight she went from being the daughter of a queen to the bastard of a disgraced woman. She was shamed by the crown itself, reduced to a pawn at court, her future uncertain. Even as she grew, that stigma remained like an invisible chain, a reminder that her claim to power was always precarious, always contested. Is it any wonder then that Elizabeth became a ruler defined by caution, by the art of survival, by the ability to project strength while guarding her private self? To witness even symbolically the destruction of her mother left a wound that shaped her instincts as queen. She learned to trust few, to mask her emotions, to use performance as armour. Where Henry had used humiliation as a weapon, Elizabeth learned to resist it by becoming impenetrable. We can only imagine the private reckoning of a daughter who grew into her mother's legend. As Queen Elizabeth never spoke of Anne at length, yet she surrounded herself with symbols that quietly reclaimed her mother's honour. Jewels, Anne once wore portraits that hinted at the Boleyn lineage, even speeches where Elizabeth framed herself as chosen by God despite the stain of her birth. In this way, Anne's trial did not just destroy a queen, it helped forge another. Out of the ashes of humiliation rose a monarch who turned trauma into power, silence into strategy, and shame into a reign that would define an era. Perhaps the most chilling detail of Anne Boleyn's fall is not the accusations themselves, nor even the swiftness with which the axe was readied. It is the reports of Henry's demeanour as his queen's world collapsed. Contemporaries wrote that Henry seemed almost exhilarated during the proceedings, that his eyes lit with satisfaction as charges were read, that a cruel smile tugged at his lips as her fate was sealed. This was no reluctant king forced to dispense harsh justice. This was a man who appeared to revel in the humiliation of the woman he once swore he loved more than life itself. Here the personal and the political fused into something darker. Henry was not only ending a marriage, he was staging a ritual of power. To watch Anne, proud, intelligent, defiant, reduced to pleading for mercy, was to reaffirm his dominance not just over her, but over all who might challenge his will. Laughter in that moment was not frivolity, it was theatre. It was the roar of a lion over prey, the sound of a ruler proving that he and he alone could decide the boundary between life and death. Psychologists today might call it sadism, the pleasure derived from another's suffering. But in the Renaissance court, this performance had a political logic. A king who could publicly destroy a queen proved that no subject, however exalted, was safe. Cruelty became spectacle, spectacle became policy. History is littered with such moments. Roman emperors like Caligula and Nero were said to take joy in watching nobles humiliated and executed in amphitheatres. Centuries later, tyrants from Stalin to Saddam Hussein staged elaborate purges, forcing victims to confess before smiling audiences. In each case, the ruler's satisfaction was not merely personal, it was part of the machinery of control. The smirk, the laugh, the apparent delight in destruction sent a message more powerful than any decree oppose me, and your suffering will become my entertainment. For Anne Boleyn, this meant her death was never just about treason or adultery. It was about annihilation, made theatrical cruelty turned into ritual. And for Henry, it marked a transformation. No longer the golden prince who sought to dazzle, he was now the tyrant who found pleasure in fear, a monarch who smiled at ruin because it reminded the world he was untouchable. If Anne Boleyn's fall was a spectacle of humiliation, Catherine Howard's marriage to Henry VIII was a nightmare of fear. She was little more than a girl, likely just 19 when she became queen, thrust into the chambers of a man nearly 3 decades her senior, already broken in body, consumed by suspicion and infamous for cruelty. Accounts from the court describe her terror vividly. Servants whispered that before she was summoned to Henry's chambers, Catherine would weep for hours, her sobs echoing down palace corridors. Imagine it a teenager trembling outside the door of a king whose leg ulcers leaked and whose temper flared with the force of thunder. To be called to his bed was not intimacy, it was submission. Each night carried the weight of survival. Henry, now deep into physical decline, treated Catherine not as a partner, but as an ornament, a bright young jewel meant to distract from his decay. But youth could not shield her. In a court where the king's body was failing, her vitality only reminded him of what he had lost. That contrast was unbearable. He demanded she act not as herself, but as proof that he was still powerful, still virile, still chosen by God. Catherine's story was not unique in its structure, only in its brutality. Across Renaissance Europe, teenage brides were bartered like treaties, their youth treated as currency in dynastic politics. They were pawns in games of statecraft, forced into beds where they held no power and no voice. But Catherine's fate exposed the predatory extremes of the Tudor court. For her marriage was not an alliance, it was a sentence. When whispers of infidelity began to circulate, Henry's paranoia seized them eagerly. Whether Catherine was guilty or not hardly mattered. Her youth and vulnerability made her an easy target for suspicion. Once accused, she was as doomed as Anne before her. The same machinery of humiliation rolled into motion the same public rituals of accusation and disgrace. Her final moments are among the most haunting in English history, dragged to the block at the Tower of London. Catherine is said to have declared, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper, the young courtier with whom she was alleged to have shared affection." Whether apocryphal or true, the statement captures the essence of her tragedy. A girl forced into a nightmare marriage with a rotting tyrant yearning for the love she was never allowed. Catherine Howard Strieber is more than the tale of a frightened teenager destroyed by her king. It is the emblem of a monarchy where women were trophies, where youth was exploited, and where power turned intimacy into predation. She entered the palace as a bride, but left it as a victim, her life a warning, etched into the history of Henry's reign. If Catherine Howard's sobs told one story, the rituals that preceded Henry's night has told another. For long before the king could summon a wife to his chamber, a grim procession of attendants had to prepare his decaying body for intimacy. The routine was nothing less than medical theatre. Servants would gather with basins and cloths, the stench of infection already thick in the air. The first task was to drain his leg ulcers, lancing swollen flesh and pressing until pus spilled out in streams. The sound of it, the hiss of pain from Henry, the wet scrape of cloth against diseased skin, became a nightly refrain in the Tudor palace. Only when the wounds were emptied as much as possible could the next stage begin. Perfumed oils imported at staggering expense were rubbed across his legs in desperate attempts to mask the stench. Frankincense and myrrh burned. In braziers, lavender water was splashed on linens, rose petals scattered on the floor. The result was not a pleasant aroma, but a suffocating haze of rot mingled with flowers, a sickly sweetness that courtiers could never quite forget. And then came the contraptions. Because the ulcers were so deep and the legs so swollen, special braces and wrappings were fitted to keep the wounds from tearing open. Linen straps were tied tightly, leather supports buckled in place so that the king's body would not literally rupture during the act that was meant to prove his manhood. The King of England, ruler of an empire where the sun supposedly never set, had to be lashed together like broken timber before he could enter his own bed. But here is the strangest detail of all: none of this happened in private. The Tudor court was built on ritual, and ritual demanded witnesses. The royal bedchamber was not a sanctuary but a stage. Dozens of attendants, grooms of the stool physicians, herbalists, perfumers, chamberlains hovered around the king. Each had their role, each sworn to sacrament, yet bound to service. Privacy in the modern sense was impossible. Even the most intimate moments of Henry's life were conducted under the eyes of those who both feared and pitied him. For his queens, this meant that the summons to Henry's bed did not lead to the embrace of a husband, but to the performance of a ritual. They entered not into secrecy, but into a chamber heavy with smoke, the air thick with perfume and fear, where a man already half dead in body demanded proof that he was still alive. To lie with Henry was not simply to endure him, it was to participate in a grotesque theatre where disease and monarchy became indistinguishable. As Henry's health collapsed, so too did his confidence in the world around him. The ulcers on his legs festered his bones, groaned, his nights were sleepless, and with every wave of pain came a deeper conviction that someone was plotting against him. Poison whispered through the lips of his enemies became his constant terror. And so the king, who had once commanded Europe's respect, descended into rituals of suspicion, where even his wives were forced to prove they were not assassins in disguise. Chroniclers describe how Henry demanded purity tests before a queen could share his bed. Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, even Catherine Parr, all were subject to humiliating demands that made intimacy a theatre of mistrust. In one grotesque example, Catherine of Aragon was forced to lick salt from her own hands to prove she was not carrying a lethal powder upon her skin. Others were made to taste wine bread or ointments in front of him before he dared to touch them. The implication was clear in Henry's mind: the very act of love might be a weapon. This was not unique to him, but his decline sharpened it into obsession. Monarchs throughout history have lived in the shadow of poison. Ivan the Terrible grew so convinced that enemies sought his death that he rotated servants, constantly forcing food tasters to prove their loyalty daily. Centuries later, Louis XIV of France transformed paranoia into elaborate ritual. The king's rising and sleeping became public ceremonies, with dozens of nobles competing for the privilege of passing him a shirt or holding his slippers. These rituals, cloaked as tradition, were in truth mechanisms of control, ensuring no one could approach the king without scrutiny. For Henry, the rituals of Paranoia fused with the rituals of the bedchamber. The private sphere of love became indistinguishable from the public sphere of politics. A kiss might conceal poison, a caress might hide betrayal. By forcing his queens to perform these humiliating acts, Henry was not only protecting himself from imagined threats, he was reasserting dominance. Each ritual reminded them that they were not partners but suspects forever on trial for their lives. The irony is stark. In seeking safety, Henry only deepened his isolation. Every salt test, every forced taste, every demand for proof pushed those closest to him further away. The man who feared poison most was in the end poisoning himself with mistrust. If poison haunted Henry's nights, then punishment from God stalked his days. The man who had torn England away from Rome, who had cast aside wives and spilled rivers of blood, began to believe that heaven itself was judging him, and that the courtroom of divine justice was his own bed. Reports tell of crucifixes hung beside his chamber of relics, laid upon pillows of holy water sprinkled on sheets before he dared climb between them. His servants were ordered to fetch oils blessed by priests, which he rubbed into his sores not just for healing but for absolution. Candles once lit for altars now flickered by his bedside, their flames a plea for mercy as much as for light. Henry had convinced himself that his failures, the miscarriages of his wives, his impotence, the absence of sons, were curses sent from above. His bed became both battlefield and confessional, where each attempt at intimacy was framed as a test of whether God had forgiven him. And when the attempts failed, as they so often did, Henry's fury turned not only upon his wives, but upon heaven itself. He believed he was Jacob wrestling with angels demanding a blessing that never came. This fusion of lust, fear, and piety was not unique to Henry, but few embodied it so grotesquely. Medieval and Renaissance rulers often saw their bodies as vessels of divine will victory. In war was proof of God's favour, while illness could be read as punishment. Yet Henry carried this belief into the most private of rituals. By dragging crucifixes and holy oils into his bed, he blurred the line between religion and obsession, turning faith into yet another instrument of control. Imagine for a moment being one of his queens. You enter not only the chamber of a sick man, but the chapel of a tyrant. Perfumed smoke mingles with the scent of decay, relics gleam in the candlelight, and the man who once shattered Christendom demands proof that you, his wife, can heal the wound between him and God. Failure meant not only his wrath, but the suggestion that you were cursed, that your body itself was the vessel of divine rejection. In this way, Henry's paranoia acquired a sanctified mask. His cruelty could be justified as piety, his humiliation of wives reframed as religious duty. Each ritual was a plea for redemption, but each failure only deepened his belief that he was marked by heaven's disfavour. And so the cycle spun: superstition, cruelty, humiliation, despair, all beneath the shadow of the cross. For all the rituals, perfumes, relics, and performances, nothing could mask the truth. Henry feared most his body no longer obeyed him in the very act that defined kingship in his own mind. The mighty monarch who had shattered England's ties to Rome in his hunger for sons who had demanded absolute obedience from his subjects now faced impotence. By his 40s, the once vigorous Henry was no longer capable of fulfilling the most basic duties of husband and king. His vast weight, diseased legs, and constant pain made intimacy impossible. Every failed attempt was not just a private embarrassment, it was in Henry's mind a cosmic humiliation. The man who had executed wives for not giving him heirs now had to confront the unspoken truth the failure was his own. But Henry was not a man who could admit weakness. Instead, he turned outward, shifting blame onto the women around him. Catherine Howard's alleged adultery became in part a convenient fiction, an explanation for why she had not conceived. If she had strayed, then the failure was hers, not his. If Anne of Cleves disgusted him, then the problem was her face, not his broken flesh. Each wife became a scapegoat for the collapse he could not name. The psychological toll was devastating. Courtiers reported violent rages after nights of failure: furniture, overturned servants, beaten queens scalded with words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. Henry's bedroom was not a sanctuary, but a chamber of humiliation where his insecurity bled into tyranny. And as his fury spread outwards, so did the fear. Noble servants, even his closest advisers, lived in terror of becoming the next victim of the king's wounded pride. In Renaissance Europe, a ruler's virility was more than a private matter. It was a symbol of divine favour and national strength. To father sons was to prove God's blessing to secure the dynasty to ensure the stability of the realm. For Henry, impotence was not just personal failure, it was evidence that heaven itself might have abandoned him. That thought was unbearable. So he silenced it the only way he knew, by silencing others. The irony is sharp. The king who sought glory through wives and sons who gambled a nation's faith on his body's performance ended up remembered not for heirs, but for humiliations. The ultimate humiliation of Henry VIII was not the stench of his ulcers or the paranoia of his rituals. It was the quiet truth that the king who ruled as if he were a god was undone by the mortal weakness of flesh. By the 1540s, Henry's court no longer revolved around pageantry or brilliance. It revolved around his temper. What had once been a monarch's occasional flare of anger became a daily performance of fury. Furniture splintered beneath his hands, goblets clattered against walls, servants trembled under his gaze, and always the threat of execution hovered like a blade above every conversation. The king's rages were legendary. A whispered word out of place, a glance misinterpreted, even the sound of a servant breathing too loudly could trigger hours of roaring. Chroniclers describe his voice carrying down stone corridors, servants clutching each other in fear as the thunder rolled through the palace. The same man who once sang madrigals and composed poetry now shouted himself hoarse, his face purple with rage, his ulcers bleeding anew from the strain. Yet perhaps more terrifying than the anger itself was its unpredictability. No one knew which Henry they would meet each morning. Would it be the genial king who cracked jokes over a hunt, or the tyrant who within an hour might condemn a man to death for a perceived slight? The uncertainty itself was a weapon, and the court adapted with desperate precision. To survive at Henry's side required performance. Courtiers learned to bow lower, laugh louder, praise more extravagantly than they ever truly felt. Every word was measured, every gesture rehearsed. Smiles became masks. Conversations became games of survival. Men and women learned to read the king's mood as though it were scripture altering their own behaviour in an instant. If Henry's face darkened, courtiers flattered. If his voice rose, they fell silent. If he joked, they laughed whether or not they understood the punchline. This was not mere etiquette. It was survival theatre. The court had become an audience trapped in a play where the king was both actor and executioner, and every misstep could be fatal. Some scholars compare it to later absolutist courts like Louis XIV's Versailles, where nobles lived in constant competition for favour. But in Henry's palace the stakes were sharper. Instead of losing influence, one could lose a head. For Henry, these rages may have provided release, the only way to vent the agony of a body that betrayed him. But for those around him, they created a culture of fear that seeped into every corner of the realm. Orders from the throne carried not only royal authority, but the echo of a man's wounded pride magnified by pain and paranoia. And so the great halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, once filled with music and laughter, became stages for dread. Every smashing goblet, every bellowed curse, every trembling servant was part of the same spectacle, a kingdom forced to dance to the rhythm of a rotting king's fury. As Henry's body collapsed and his rages consumed the court, a darker conviction took root in his mind. Perhaps God could be bargained with. Perhaps if enough lives were taken, if enough blood was spilled, heaven would restore what his flesh had lost. This was no metaphor. Chroniclers record that after failed nights in the bedchamber, Henry would erupt into fresh waves of cruelty. Executions spiked in these years, not only of wives accused of adultery or treason, but of courtiers, servants, even old allies. Some had committed minor offences, others were simply inconvenient. All became offerings in Henry's desperate attempt to appease a god he believed was punishing him. It is a chilling image of the King of England treating human life as sacrifice, each head on the block, another plea for divine mercy. In Henry's mind, the axe was not merely an instrument of justice, it was an altar. The condemned knelt not only before the executioner, but before the king's belief that death could buy him redemption. This logic was not unique to Henry. Across history, rulers have sought to bargain with heaven through blood. The Aztec emperors offered captives to the sun to ensure its rising. Medieval kings went on crusade imagining that war itself could wipe away sin. Even in the modern era, tyrants from Stalin to Pol Pot cloaked purges in language of purification as if killing could heal a nation. In Henry's case, the sacrifices were intensely personal. Every body that fell beneath the blade was in his mind a step toward curing his humiliation. But the cure never came. His body remained broken, his nights remained haunted, and the blood only deepened the shadow over his reign. What was left behind was not a healed king, but a kingdom marked by fear, where every subject knew that their life could be claimed at a whim, transformed into a sacrifice for the king's insecurities. In this way, Henry's private torment reshaped England's public life. The axe at Tower Hill, once reserved for traitors, became a tool of personal superstition. Mercy was abandoned, replaced by ritual killing. The court no longer asked whether a man was guilty, but whether his death might soothe the king's pain. And so the execution block darkened by blood became Henry's most trusted physician. And yet it never healed him. It only revealed the depth of his desperation, a monarch who believed that by destroying others he might restore himself. Among the wreckage of Henry's marriages, one story stands apart not as tragedy but as improbable survival. It belongs to Anne of Cleves, the German princess who against all odds managed to walk away from the Tudor court with her head still on her shoulders, her dignity largely intact and her future surprisingly comfortable. Her marriage to Henry was arranged in 1540, born of politics rather than passion. England needed Protestant allies on the continent, and Anne, the sister of the Duke of Cleves, seemed a suitable match. When Hans Holbein painted her portrait for Henry's approval, she appeared demure, modest, and agreeable. Yet the king, who judged women like one might judge a horse, found himself appalled when they finally met in person. "I like her not," Henry declared, dismissing her as unattractive, her manners foreign, her presence uninspiring. This was more than cruel disappointment. It was a cultural clash. Anne, raised in the sober courts of northern Germany, arrived in England with little knowledge of its flamboyant etiquette. She spoke no English, dressed plainly by Tudor standards, and lacked the refined musical and conversational skills Henry expected. In truth, she had never been trained for seduction. She had been trained to be obedient, respectable, and politically useful. But in Henry's eyes, now clouded by insecurity, paranoia, and obsession with appearances, she seemed a failure from the start. And yet her failure became her salvation. Within months, Henry moved to annul the marriage on grounds of non-consummation, claiming he found her so unappealing that he could not perform. For another wife, this might have been the first step toward the scaffold. But Anne, far from resisting, agreed readily. She accepted the annulment without protest, declared Henry her dear brother, and gracefully stepped aside. It was an act of political genius, whether intentional or instinctive. By submitting to Henry's will without resistance, Anne transformed herself from wife to ally. Henry in turn rewarded her compliance with a generous settlement, castles, estates, and a position of honour as the king's sister. Unlike Catherine Howard, who soon followed her to the block, Anne lived out her days in relative peace and comfort, a quiet presence on the edges of court, respected by Henry's daughters, even attending Elizabeth I's coronation years later. In a reign littered with the corpses of wives, Anne of Cleves stands as the anomaly, the queen who survived by surrendering. Her story highlights not only Henry's cruelty, but also the narrow pathways women could take to preserve themselves, where Catherine Howard's youth doomed her, and Anne Boleyn's defiance destroyed her. Anne of Cleves' humility, genuine or carefully performed, allowed her to escape the nightmare with her life. Her fate, almost serene compared to the others, remains one of the most striking ironies of Henry's reign. In a world where queenship was often a death sentence, Anne's survival became her quiet victory. For all the perfume burned in his chambers, for all the ceremonies meant to cloak decay, Henry's greatest secret could never truly be hidden. His body, crippled by ulcers, humiliated by impotence, consumed by paranoia, was the engine of his political disasters. What began as a man's private dysfunction soon cascaded into one of the most consequential ruptures in Western history. At the core of Henry's obsession lay a single terror failure to produce sons, the collapse of his marriages. Anne Boleyn's execution, Catherine of Aragon's humiliation, the swift annulments of others, all circled around this anxiety. Each wife became a scapegoat for what Henry could not admit to himself, that his own diseased body was the obstacle to dynastic stability. And because he could not accept the blame, he shifted the burden onto England itself. The break with Rome was not born of theology alone, it was born of desperation. To free himself from Catherine of Aragon and pursue Anne Boleyn, Henry tore England from the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England, with himself as its supreme head. What he justified as divine authority was at its root a bid to conceal his weakness. The Pope refused him a divorce, so Henry made himself a pope. Personal crisis became national revolution. The consequences were seismic. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were dissolved. Their treasures seized, their lands parcelled out to loyal nobles. Thousands of monks and nuns were cast adrift. Centuries-old traditions of worship were uprooted overnight. The kingdom convulsed with rebellion. The pilgrimage of grace in the north saw tens of thousands march against Henry's religious changes, only to be crushed with ruthless efficiency. And beyond England, the shockwaves spread across Europe. Wars of religion erupted as Protestant and Catholic powers clashed each side, invoking Henry's schism as either inspiration or warning. The English Reformation was not a single act of policy, it was a chain reaction. Generations of persecution followed, Catholics executed for treason, and Protestants burned as heretics when the crown shifted back. The soil of England was stained with the blood of those caught between a king's insecurity and a nation's divided faith. It is tempting to think of history's great turning points as inevitable, shaped by ideas and movements larger than any one man. Yet here we see the brutal truth: world history was altered by the body of a single king. A rotting leg, a failing bed, a fear of impotence. These became the tinder that lit the fire of the English Reformation. Millions would live and die in its shadow, their fates sealed not by divine decree but by the insecurities of Henry VIII. His broken body became England's broken church. His personal failures became Europe's wars, and his attempt to hide weakness left a legacy of blood and division that endured long after his bones crumbled in their tomb. The break with Rome might have begun as Henry's solution to a personal crisis, but its consequences rippled outward into the marrow of England. What started in the king's bedchamber bled into the fields, the churches, and the homes of ordinary men and women who had no choice but to live with the aftermath of his insecurity. The most immediate shock came with the dissolution of the monasteries. Across the countryside, abbeys that had stood for centuries were stripped bare, their treasures seized, their libraries scattered, their bells melted down for cannon. Monks and nuns who had lived their entire lives in service were turned into beggars overnight. The sick who had been tended in monastic hospitals, the poor who had received alms at monastery gates, suddenly found themselves abandoned. Henry enriched his coffers and rewarded loyal nobles with the spoils, but the fabric of local life was torn apart. Religious practice too became a battlefield. For generations, villagers had prayed to saints, lit candles for their dead, and believed their parish churches were portals to the divine. Now altars were smashed relics, discarded, and the familiar rhythms of devotion replaced by new rituals in English instead of Latin. For some, this was liberation, the word of God in their own tongue at last. For others, it was desecration, a severing of ties to ancestors and eternity. Families were divided not only by opinion but by survival. A careless word of loyalty to the Pope could bring charges of treason. The Crown's policies shifted with every succession. Under Henry, Catholicism was gutted, but not destroyed. Under his son, Edward VI, Protestant reforms accelerated. Then came Mary Viristos, who tried to drag England back to Rome, burning Protestants in a campaign that earned her the name Bloody Mary. And finally Elizabeth of Fuss, who crafted a fragile compromise, though not without her own persecutions. Each swing of the pendulum claimed more lives, each monarch inheriting not only a throne, but the bloodstains of Henry's schism. And beyond England's shores, Europe watched with fascination and horror. Catholic Spain and France saw an island torn from Christ's fold, while Protestant states saw a powerful ally in their struggle against Rome. Wars of religion raged across the continent, fueled in part by the precedent Henry had set that kings could unmake faith as easily as they unmade marriages. The 30 Years' War. The persecution of minorities. The centuries of sectarian conflict that followed all bore traces of the crack first opened by a king's wounded pride. The Reformation was no mere theological debate. It was a blood-soaked inheritance passed down through generations who never chose it, reshaping how Europeans understood God, power, and themselves. And its origins, grotesquely enough, lay not in lofty counsels or divine visions, but in the rotting flesh and tormented ego of one man who could not bear his own reflection. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII had perfected a system of power that went beyond kingship. It was a blueprint for tyranny, a set of methods so effective that dictators centuries later would unconsciously echo them. The first tool was scapegoating. Whenever his own failures became too obvious to conceal the miscarriages, the lack of sons, the impotence he could never admit, Henry shifted the blame. Catherine of Aragon was cast as a cursed wife who defied God's will. Anne Boleyn was branded an adulteress and witch. Catherine Howard became a harlot who betrayed him. In every case, the problem was never Henry. It was always the woman, the subject, the advisor, anyone but the king himself. The second tool was rewriting reality. Official chronicles were scrubbed of inconvenient truths. Portraits were painted to show him broad-shouldered and vigorous long after he could barely walk. Decrees declared his will to be God's command, turning personal vendettas into divine justice. What could not be hidden was reframed, and what could not be reframed was erased. To live in Henry's England was to live in a world where history itself bent under the weight of royal insecurity. And the third tool was elimination. Rivals, friends, even family members, none were safe if they threatened the king's narrative. Sir Thomas More once his trusted counsellor executed for defying the new church. Thomas Cromwell, who had engineered Henry's break with Rome, destroyed when his usefulness ended. Wives, nobles, priests, poets, the axe fell wherever it needed to pruning away anyone who dared to reflect his weakness back at him. These methods were not unique to Henry, but he fused them with the machinery of monarchy in a way that feels eerily modern. Stalin too turned failures of his regime into crimes of imagined traitors, staging show trials where victims confessed to impossible sins. Hitler built a Reich on scapegoats, declaring Jews communists and others responsible for Germany's defeats. Mao rewrote Chinese history, with each campaign erasing yesterday's truths and punishing anyone who clung to them. The pattern is chillingly consistent: blame others for your weakness, eliminate those who excused them, and rewrite reality so thoroughly that even memory itself becomes a tool of the state. Henry may have worn velvet and ermine instead of uniforms, but the logic was the same. His insecurity became a political system, his personal rage a national doctrine. And like every tyrant after him, Henry left behind a nation that had been forced to bend under the weight of his wounds. A people trained to perform loyalty to repeat lies as truth to bow not only to the crown, but to the insecurities of the man who wore it. Henry VIII's body did more than betray him. It became a mirror of his reign, a metaphor for the monarchy itself. The ulcers that refused to heal, the bones that cracked under his own weight, the stench that filled every chamber. These were not only symptoms of disease, but emblems of the rot that spread through his court, his marriages, and his kingdom. In his youth, Henry had embodied the ideal of Renaissance majesty, tall, athletic, radiant with vitality. But his final years revealed the other truth that unchecked appetite, paranoia, and cruelty consumed not only flesh, but also legacy. His body decayed, and with it decayed the bonds of trust between crown and people, between England and Rome, between king and queen. The irony could not be sharper. The man who dreamed of eternal glory became remembered as a warning. His power was absolute, yet it could not cure the humiliation of his weakness. His cruelty was unmatched, yet it could not erase the fear that gnawed him in the dark. The rot within him did not stop at his skin. It seeped outward, infecting Law's faith and generations who inherited the fractures he left behind. And so Henry's story leaves us with a lesson that transcends Tudor palaces and English history. When personal weakness fuses with absolute power, the result is catastrophe. A king's insecurities became wars of religion. A husband's impotence became the persecution of wives. A man's fear of decay became the dismemberment of a church and the deaths of countless subjects. What should have remained the private struggles of one human life reshape the destiny of nations. History remembers Henry VIII, not for his conquests or his reforms, but for the cruelty born of his fragility. His body became a metaphor for his soul, swollen with excess, eaten away from within, desperate to project strength, while crumbling beneath the surface. And in this he is not alone. Every empire that mistakes fear for authority, every ruler who cloaks insecurity and violence, every system that feeds on humiliation rather than compassion, follows the same path. They all rot from the inside out. 5 centuries later, Henry's portrait still glares from gallery walls broad and unyielding. But look past the paint and you see the truth: a man devoured by his own hunger, his own terror, his own need to be remembered as what he never truly was. The lesson endures: unchecked power destroys, an insecurity in the hands of the mighty can reshape the world in blood. Henry VIII wanted immortality. What he achieved instead was a cautionary tale, a reminder that the rot within power is the rot that consumes empires, leaving behind only silent scars, and a warning carved into history. The rot within power lessons from Henry VIII. History often paints Henry VIII in caricature, the bloated king with 6 wives, turkey, leg in hand, glaring from portraits. Yet when we peel back the layers, the story of Henry is not only about monarchy, but about the devastating consequences of unchecked insecurity and power. His body rotted from the inside out, his mind spiraled into paranoia, and his desperation for control reshaped the fate of nations. In the end, his life leaves us with lessons as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. The first lesson is the danger of denying weakness. Henry could not accept that his body was failing him. Instead of confronting the truth, he shifted blame onto others, his wives, his advisors, even his people. This refusal to own his shortcomings set in motion executions, schisms, and wars. On a personal level, it reminds us of the importance of humility to admit when we are vulnerable to seek help and to acknowledge that imperfection is part of being human. Left unacknowledged, insecurity can metastasize into cruelty. The second lesson is the corrosive effect of absolute power. Henry's word was law unchecked by Parliament, church, or conscience. In such an environment, his personal fears became national crises. His hunger for sons became the English Reformation. His rage became the terror of courtiers. His superstition became the deaths of countless innocents. History shows us that when power concentrates without accountability, the flaws of one man can devastate millions. For our own time, it is a warning every society must build safeguards against the tyranny of ego, whether in politics, business, or family life. The third lesson lies in the illusion of image. Henry demanded portraits that showed him strong and majestic even when he could barely walk. Yet what endured in memory was not the painted colossus, but the truth of his decay. We too live in an age of curated images and public masks. Henry reminds us that appearances may win admiration for a moment, but authenticity and the character behind the image is what shapes legacy. Finally, Henry's life teaches us that cruelty leaves deeper scars than achievement. He built ships, waged wars, restructured a church, but he is remembered above all for the women he destroyed and the fear he instilled. In our own lives, the measure of greatness will not be in what we accumulate or command, but in how we treat those who are most vulnerable to our power. In the end, Henry's body was a metaphor for his reign, swollen with excess, riddled with infection, and consumed by rot. His story is a cautionary tale that power without compassion is ruinous, and that insecurity wielded as authority can scar generations. To remember Henry honestly is not to revel in scandal, but to heed the warning he embodies that true strength lies not in domination, but in self-awareness, restraint, and humanity. Thank you. Subscribe now and don't miss what's to come.